Hey guys, welcome to the LT Brings the Heat podcast. We're your hosts, Sean Laird and Adam Heisler, where we talk about baseball and sports performance. With topics ranging from coaching, business, and player development, our goal is to bring you a no BS approach to development in baseball and sports performance. Hope you guys enjoy. Let's rock and roll. Hey guys, welcome to the episode of LT Brings the Heat. We're your hosts, Sean Laird and Adam Heisler. We got a special episode today, and I know I say that a lot, but this is a big one because this is a highly controversial episode. This is actually going to be two parts. We're going to talk about weighted baseballs and the training of weighted baseballs, and then kind of the topics and the arguments that people have for them and against them. We're going to try to cover as much science as we can and the history, but also our stances on them and how we use them or what we use when we use them. But it's definitely something that we had to, I think that we had to put into two parts because our guests in the next episode, which will be Ryan Garten and Keegan Curtis, they're professional ball players, pitch at a very high level. We kind of want to get their opinions on it and not really, influence them whatsoever. So this first episode, me and Adam are going to kind of touch on it and give our X's and O's and kind of see if we can't reach out to as many people as possible. Because this is something that, there's a lot of research and articles out there, but it's kind of one of those things like there's so much information, there's no information type thing. Like there's so many avenues to kind of go through, and it's hard to pick through the eyewash and pick through the stuff that's really good, pick through the stuff that's not biased. I know there's a lot of programs, and I've heard a lot of the high schools are using weighted balls, and a lot of them very improperly. So I think this is an episode that needs to be done, and we probably should have done a lot earlier, but there's just so many things that we want to cover in this podcast. But Adam, how's everything going with you? And what's some stuff you want to touch on with the weighted balls as we get going?
Yeah, man, it's going to be a fun episode because we mentioned before we came on, like we're both asked about weighted balls probably once a week from whether it's a dad or a player or somebody that's just interested in learning about it because they hear the kind of the myths of that's how you're going to gain velocity really fast. And you got to be very careful on how you dissect this situation, how you kind of persuade them to do it. And one thing I would really encourage, whether it's a coach that's listening, is before you institute this with your players, like give it a try for yourself. And not necessarily that you're going to come back and try to pitch, but it's just you're kind of understanding what you're about to put your guys through because the mechanics are huge about it, as well as just the way you use the system. And I think to go ahead and knock out the biggest kind of scheme out there is you just don't grab the weighted balls and chunk them around and all of a sudden you start throwing really hard. So there's a method to this that you have to be very careful about because injuries are a big part of it, and especially arm injuries. In baseball, you deal with more arm injuries than you deal with any other injury in the game of baseball. So you got to be cautious about this stuff. And we're going to kind of give our stance on it, like you said today, and then we're going to bring in Ryan and Keegan, and we're going to kind of propose questions to them. Like we don't know much about this, so they can kind of give their spiel and everything. So it's going to be almost coming from four different directions. So it's going to be really cool to hear where we kind of agree on things, maybe disagree, or the similarities that we all have and share the same opinion. So I'm excited about this one. I think it's going to be a good topic that a lot of listeners are going to want to listen to.
Absolutely. And I'll just kind of go straight into it. I'm going to kind of touch on the science and the history of weighted balls for the guys that are listening. I know that a lot of people really think this just came on in the last 10 years, but with Driveline's popularity, that kind of like really reignited weighted ball training. And if you read their articles on Driveline, like they are constantly referencing old studies and people that have done there before. Dr. Coop Duran, and Dr. Fleissig and all these docs that have done the research and the ASMI studies, which I'm going to talk about that study from 2017 that was people freaked out about in the baseball world. But basically, essentially in the late 70s and early 80s, that Dr. Coop Duran, who I was talking about before, I believe, and I read this article, it was an article from Tom House years ago. And actually I touched up on it a little bit earlier today, just to make sure I got some things right. Because a lot of the articles and stuff that I've read over the years, sometimes it's been a ways back and some of them I've read recently because I always want to keep up to date. But they kind of did a study and that Dr. Coop he was originally, I think, out of the University of Hawaii, I believe, but he did a study with weighted balls, and that's where they initially came up with the plus 20%, minus 20% overload, underload training, which for those who are listening, a regular baseball is 5 ounces. So, they started going overload training at 6 ounces and underload training at 4 ounces. And I wrote this down so I can make sure I get this right. They published a book called Implementing Weight Training. That's all it was called. But essentially, they talk about how they're implementing the weighted ball training, why they're implementing it, and the velocity increases and so forth. But to kind of touch on nowadays, like that's from the beginnings. And I remember in the 90s, I had buddies that I played ball with. You would see these weighted ball mesh packages of weighted balls and people throwing long toss all the time. And I personally never threw a weighted ball, like an actual weighted baseball. I threw a 5-ounce baseball and I threw a ton of football growing up, which is, I'll touch on what we do in the future. I want to kind of let everybody know that I'm going to try to talk about where I stand later and just kind of talk about the science and history of it right now. But this stuff's been going on for a long period of time. I do know that Tom House and some others at University of Southern California in 2008, they actually did a weighted ball study, a weighted ball training regimen where they were trying to fix GERD, which is glenohumeral internal rotation deficit in a lot of throwers. And what they found from that study in 2008, they actually increased throwing velocity from that study. So I haven't read the study from the 70s and 80s, but they originally talked about the plus 20%, the overload, underload from there. This study, they were completely trying to fix a problem and ended up showing, hey, this is actually helping guys increase in velocity. So if you think about it, like a lot of people look at it like, oh, weighted ball training is horrible. It's bad for you. Or weighted ball training, it's great for you. Everybody's been throwing, like people throw 1-ounce wiffle balls, 2-ounce tennis balls all the time. 16-ounce footballs, junior footballs, I think are 11 or 12 ounces. So people are throwing them all the time. People throw rocks all the time. So the actual, risk of injury, there's a lot more than just saying, hey, it's a weighted ball. Weighted ball is bad, right? Regular ball is good. Like there's so much more that goes into it from the science. And I want everybody to know that there's different types of weighted ball throwing. So most people think, oh, you're throwing a ball, you're throwing long toss, or you're throwing a running gun. You're throwing and releasing a weighted ball, but there's multiple ways to do it. Like I know the National Pitching Association, NPA, they actually do weighted holds where they're throwing and holding onto a ball the whole time. I do know that the Florida Baseball Ranch used to do those as well, and now they've transitioned into using the throwing sock. Where they'll have a 7-ounce ball in the sock, and that's really the holds. The whole theory behind the holds is back in the day, I think it was 2010. And again, I'm referencing Tom House a lot. I'm a big Tom House guy. I like Tom House. I also like Driveline. I like all those guys. Anybody it's the forefront of the game of baseball, I love listening to. Doesn't mean I agree with everything that they say. I just love listening to these guys. But he was watching, I think it was Wimbledon, and he's watching this 8-hour long match. And he asked a question to himself of like, hey, why are these tennis players able to hit a tennis ball with their racket and repeat this similar throwing motion to a baseball player over and over and over and over, and their arms don't get hurt? Their arms, they don't have the injury rates that baseball players have. And the answer was they hold on to the racket. And because they hold on to the racket, they're training their decelerators. And when you train your decelerators, obviously it's going to protect you as you're finishing your follow through with a racket, or obviously finishing your follow through with a throw. And so you've got 3 muscles that essentially accelerate the arm. You got 2 muscles that decelerate the arm. So if we know that at a 3-to-2 ratio, those 2 muscles that decelerate, that it's very, very important to take care of that. So that way your arm stays healthy. And as the old adage and the old, analogy goes, like if you're driving a Corvette, and you're looking flying, looking good, but you don't have brakes, you're going to crash, like something's going to go wrong. And so when I actually heard that, and I heard that I was introduced to holds, I think back in 2013 or 2014, I believe. I'm not for sure on the date. And so I had it was the winter of 2014. I just remembered. And I had just had my second labrum rotator cuff surgery and a biceps tenodesis in my arm, which I still like. The biceps tenodesis, for those who don't know, they drilled my biceps tendon in my humerus. Sucks. I wish they wouldn't have done that. But I still deal with that today. And so I started doing these holds and doing some arm circles with some weighted balls, and my arm started feeling a lot better. And I go, man, it's unbelievable how great my arm feels. Now, granted, my arm, like for those who are listening, I just try to throw BP and feel good to throw BP nowadays. I'm not trying to light it up and, throw hard. Because of that, I want to be able to continue lifting and doing stuff. So keep that in mind as I'm saying this. But I was like, you know what? All these weighted baseball training is really popular. Throwing velocity programs are starting to pick up popular. I want to introduce a throwing camp for Laird's training, and I want to make sure that we do everything the best way possible, the smartest way possible. And so we started doing that over there, and I'll touch on later on with that. But for me, that science of holding onto the racket made so much more sense. And so as I kept reading and kept studying with Tom House and the NPA, they started talking about force production and how they implement their weighted ball training. So The way the MPA does it, which is a little bit different than Driveline, obviously, there's a lot of similarities and so forth. But and there a lot. Don't get me wrong. I'm just using the MPA and Driveline because they're kind of the most popular. There's a bunch of other ways that people use weighted balls, but MPA they'll kind of have a progression, and they give you like 12 years and younger. This is what you should do. 13 years and older. This is what you should do. 18 years and older. So they're not treating everybody the same. They're treating everybody different. And every program I've read, they have an initial assessment. And this is something that people that are listening that don't do. They want to get into weighted ball training immediately, and they don't understand that there's an assessment of the body, strength and core stability assessment, mobility assessment. You're trying to find out some flaws and some issues that could cause an injury, or a mechanical assessment as well that could cause an injury to the player. And I think that's the biggest step that is skipped that causes a lot of the injury rates that you hear. But anyways, they go from a throwing from the knees to, your crow hop or your run and gun throws and your mound throws. And essentially, I'll kind of break it down like this. If somebody weighs 200 pounds, a throw from your knees, the force production into the ground is 200 pounds. It's the same amount. So if you weigh 200 pounds, it's 200 pounds. If you're running and you're kind of throwing, you're getting a crow hop, like a actual crow hop, it's actually 4 times your body weight. So like a run and gun and crow hops you see from outfielders from the outfield. So instead of it being 200-pound force production, that 200-pound athlete is actually applying 800 pounds of force production. So that's a lot more. And obviously, and another one, if you're just stepping and throwing, it's only 2 times the production. So you're looking at 400 pounds. So it's a big difference between just playing catch and actually throwing a crow hop, run and gun throw, the amount of force. And then on the mound, and this is where Tom Howson, he's been talking about this for years. The only thing that's unnatural of a throwing motion for a baseball player is being on the mound, is what they say. And being on the mound, it creates a lot more force into the ground, and it puts a lot more stress, obviously, on the body. And that is, throwing from the mound is 6 times your body weight. So that would be 1,200 pounds of force for a 200-pound person. So that's 400-pound more force production than a person throwing a running gun. And sorry for those that are listening, that was a lot of numbers I was just throwing in right there. But I saw that, I read that. I was like, man, that's really interesting. And essentially they talked about that. That was the main reason they don't throw weighted balls, the MPA specifically, or they don't advocate throwing weighted balls from a mound. And I remember reading Driveline, they had the similar theories, but they've also done studies on throwing on the mound as well, specifically to that 2017 ASMI study. But they don't do that because that force, obviously, if it's more on the mound, that increases the likelihood of injury. So there's the issue is like, what's most important? Like, we want to develop guys, but we also want to prevent them from having injury. So let's look at the Driveline aspect of things. They actually will throw and release balls a lot. They do their pivot pickoffs, a lot of these throws. And I read Hacking the Kinetic Chain a long time ago, and I'm not as up to date with a lot of their stuff, but like in the most recent years. But I do know, like, an original study, I was just reading an article talking about it, and people think, hey, weighted balls, you're going to increase velocity no matter what. And Driveline even talks about it. Like, one of their earlier studies, that only 50% of people increase velocity in their weighted ball training. So that, the numbers aren't sky high. You got to think about the bell curve with certain programs. If you're using a similar program, some guys are going to get really good results. Some guys are going to stay the same. Some guys might get worse, depending on the type of program that you're doing. And with them, they're constantly doing research and they're updating every single year. Like, I do know, and I'll kind of touch on the 2017 ASMI study. What people started freaking out about that study, because in 2017, they said, hey, 25% of pitchers that are involved in weighted baseball programs or camps or so forth, 25% of them get injured. And people, the weighted baseball community specifically, they freaked out about it and like, oh no, that's not true, and blah, 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 blah. And that study from ASMI, I think it had Dr. Andrews, Mike Reynolds, and a couple other guys I'm not familiar with, but I read stuff from Reynolds all the time about weighted training. They were trying to figure out why, weighted baseballs work, what the risk is and so forth. And essentially, from what I've read and what I've understood is the increase in velocity has a direct correlation with the increase in external rotation. So the increase in external rotation in throwers from weighted baseball training will therefore help increase the velocity. Some people will agree with that correlation. Some people don't. Also, overspeeding, like teaching your body and having a neural adaptation to underload training, teaching your body to throw faster. I kind of compare that in the weight room to dynamic effort training in the conjugate system, like Louis Simmons talks about, is you're teaching your body to throw faster. And with the weighted ball training, you're throwing something heavier, but it also slows things down to help you repattern your throwing motion. So there's a lot of positives, and you can say obviously negatives from doing either side of those. But what they found is, the study, the heavier the ball, the more increase in external rotation. And one of the most recent studies they did is they wanted to test what happens to athletes right after they get done throwing a weighted ball. And for those that don't know, the increase in external rotation, if your shoulder joint and the integrity and your body is not accumulated and adapted to that increase in external rotation, it's going to create more valgus stress in the elbow. It's going to put you at a lot higher risk for injury. And because of that, that's why the preparation and the strength and conditioning and your plyo care, whatever you want to call it, that's why it's so important to take care of your arm. For us, we do a lot of rice buckets and so forth. But if you get that increase in external rotation too fast, like they said, a 1 pound ball in the most recent study, I believe, increased external rotation by 8 degrees, which is crazy. And then the lower weighted balls, I think like the 9 ounce balls, somewhere right around there, was right around 3 degrees. So that was an alarming thing for them, because they wanted to figure out like, hey, like we don't want to have this high injury rate, and we want to make sure that we're doing this. And those guys like Reynolds and them, they don't have a dog in the fight. So they're not trying to sell a certain product. They consider themselves scientists. They're just showing data and what they can do. And so, as I was mentioning earlier, that Dr. Fleissig, that's one of the doctors that really tested what do these weighted balls do in stress with the elbow. And essentially what we know is the weighted balls, it increases stress and changes the stress involved in the arm. And the heavier the ball, the more external rotation and the more stress is going to be on the elbow and the joints. So joint integrity is a big factor when doing weighted ball training. And with that, saying that, people have got to understand that, part of this and to kind of make sure I'm playing devil's advocate here, there are a lot of research that shows that weighted balls work. There's a lot of research that shows that injury rates can be very high for guys that are using weighted balls. No matter who is using a weighted ball system, no matter who is implementing a weighted ball system, if anybody is good at what they do, like Driveline and MPA and those organizations are great at what they do, they will always tell you how important the assessment is, how important preparation of your body is, preparation of the joints, the integrity of your joints, the importance of mechanics, all of those things. Every article I read, they talked about how important those things were. That right there is kind of the things that I see that is misstepped the most. People just want to throw weighted balls and get the quick fix of increasing velocity, instead of actually following the science and following a step program. And the analogy that I use all the time is, I'm like, hey, if I got a kid that shows up in the weight room, is he going to squat 300 pounds immediately? No. Is the kid capable of squatting 300 pounds? Well, it depends on who's showing up in the weight room, obviously, but I can't load a disrupted movement. If somebody's not moving efficiently, if somebody has horrible technique, if somebody's, got some issues, maybe he just had a back injury. Is it smart for me to load that spine? Absolutely not. So to me, that stuff is common sense, that we need to be smart in understanding why weighted balls, there's only a certain type of people to use them. And I'll talk about my opinions later, but I kind of wanted to touch down a little bit of the science from this and what it does and the differences between holds and throws and releases, like the Drivelines of the world. But Adam, I kind of want to get your knowledge base and your opinion on, because I know you guys have used a lot of stuff from Florida Baseball Ranch and things in the past, but kind of what do you have for us?
Yeah, I mean, all that information you just covered there was really, really knowledgeable. I mean, I even learned some things there that I didn't know about it. So it's a good base. I think the two myths that you've got to knock out right away is, just because you do weighted balls doesn't mean you're going to start throwing harder, like Sean just mentioned. And then just because I do weighted balls doesn't automatically mean I'm going to injure my throwing arm. So those are two big things I think that kind of, to get out there, get off the bat, to kind of know what you're stepping into. And like kids will mention, or parents will mention, that they're doing Driveline. And I always come back with, well, Driveline isn't anything. Like, that's just the name of a program. Like, doing Driveline, there's no such thing. So just because you go to their website, you buy the weighted ball package, and you start doing them at your house, if you haven't had body assessments, if you don't have good mechanics, if you're not physically strong, you're not going to see these results that you're expecting, as well as you might injure yourself. So that's the stuff you've got to be really cautious about. I wouldn't go start doing weighted balls with somebody that hasn't had experience with players in the past. and had like a background of studying this stuff. That's how you're going to get in some deep water, and you're going to find yourself in more trouble than whenever you first started. So guys that don't know much about it, ask questions, do your research. John's done a plenty of research on it. He's looked up different things. He nailed it with Tom House. He's nailed it with Driveline. Like, these guys are very good at what they do, but they don't have a 100% success rate, just like nobody else. I mean, if there was a 100% success rate, everybody in the country would be doing this stuff. So there's not a perfect cure-all for any of this. And that's another thing you've got to get across is just because I'm buying and ordering this stuff doesn't mean I'm going to see the results that I'm expecting. You still have to put in the hard work, and you still have to do all of these things the right direction. One thing that stuck out to me was throwing the weighted balls from the mound. That's one I haven't heard before, but I also now it makes sense why we don't do it, because the ground force reaction and the stress that it puts on you from the mound. And I can think about every time we've had athletes do weighted ball stuff in our facility, it's always flat ground. It's always the plyo wall. Now it makes sense why. And I just never understood. I just figured it's probably not good to throw it from the mound with the weighted ball in your hand. And now it kind of backs up everything of why you do it from the flat ground. And I like that you pointed out about the throwing motion of a baseball player, because everybody automatically will bring up right away that it's a non-traditional throwing motion. That's why your shoulder or your arm hurts when you throw baseball. Well, no, technically from the flat ground, it doesn't really matter. It's if you're having arm problems, it's probably because you have some bad mechanics in there or you're not strong enough. But from the mound, now it makes sense why you will have that stress that's put on your arm, that now we have to try to build those decelerators, as you mentioned, to help us recover after we do put our body through a strenuous work of throwing a bullpen, throwing in game, whatever it is that you're working on there. So a lot of great points that you cover, man. Just based off what we've done at our facility, we just experimented with the weighted balls this past summer. And I still think we were cautious about it. We didn't dive in full speed ahead. Not everybody is doing these weighted balls. I was more along the lines, hey, let's try to keep it as safe as possible. So if you're 13 and under, like, I don't even want you kind of messing with it right now. Now, if you're going to throw some plyo walls against the plyo wall, and yeah, that's fine. As we're working arm path, we're working cleaning up some throwing mechanics. That's perfectly fine. Now, if you're actually on a weighted ball routine of throwing these balls hard and using your body and crow hops or whatever, then let's be a little bit more cautious. See where you're at strength-wise, maturity-wise. How grown are you? Are you going through that growing stage, or are you kind of peaked out? Where's your body at right now? And this is all stuff that we've done is after the assessment. So our PT came in and he did the assessments the day one on all, I think we had 14 athletes, and they all had to go through a PT test at first to see range of motion abilities, strengths, weaknesses, where they need to improve on, or lack of mobility. And with those, kind of gave us a clear picture on who can do what, who's intermediate, who's a beginner, who's an advanced. And now you can kind of put them in their different paths. And so when they would come in and work with their groups, the advanced guys were with each other. The immediate and the intermediate and the beginners were all with each other. So now they're doing 2 or 3 totally different things that maybe one of the older guys does that the younger guys don't. So it just kind of helps you understand it's not a cookie cutter system. So when you get ready to buy these things, if you're buying a Driveline packet, if you're buying a Florida Baseball Ranch packet, do your research get on YouTube to watch and try to find out what's going on. But most importantly, like Sean said earlier, is like, there's so much information out there that it's kind of hard to understand all this stuff. Because I think it's just like anything in life, you're going to have a lot of people that maybe agree with it, and then you're going to have others that, hey, this is why I don't agree with it. I've had an injury because of it. Okay, well, what happened and what caused that injury? Or I've had great results with the other guy. Man, I did it for 6 weeks and I didn't see anything. So there's just so much more to the picture. And we talk about all the time is being as strong as possible. And that is so important, squats, to how much power can I put out of my body and not just depend on my arm the whole time. Because I can promise you, if you're just doing a weighted ball program and you're not working out, you're not going to see results. And you're honestly probably going to end up hurting yourself more, because Sean mentioned now the throwing motion has changed some and you're not ready for it. So that's where your elbow will start to bother you. And now you're out for the season because you tried to mess around and do something that your body wasn't ready for and that you didn't know much about. So, Sean, I thought you did a great job covering all that information. Hey, was it a lot of information? Yes, but it was good, like, to understand. I learned some things. I know our listeners had to learn some things. So now kind of talk about what have you done with your system and your throwing program that you've seen that you liked, or maybe something that you tried it and you didn't like it, so you kind of exited that out and moved on to something else.
That's a really good question. I had myself muted for a second, but when you talked about injury rates, and this is something for people to understand, is like, you have a risk for injury in everything you do. You could walk across the street and get injured. Does that mean you're going to stop walking across the street if something happens, you trip and break your ankle? No, you have to understand that there's risk reward with everything that you do. The best facilities in the world will have injuries. The worst facilities in the world have injuries. What we've got to understand is, are we doing everything we can to protect the athlete, build the athlete first, on top of, increasing the tools of the athlete? I think that's one thing that's commonly missed in the fact that, me as a strength coach, I look at things in a completely different perspective than a lot of baseball guys do. And Adam, you have a similar background in that aspect. And for me, it's like, my job is to keep guys healthy first, because if I keep guys healthy, the program is going to work in itself. I got to keep them healthy first. Well, I'm never worried about the program. And it sounds very arrogant and cocky when I tell parents, like, hey, they were like, oh man, he's making so many gains. And, I'm not surprised, because the kid just worked hard. He's done everything he's supposed to do, and he stayed healthy. Like, that's what's supposed to happen. But to answer your question, Adam, I started doing velocity type or throwing hard programs, whatever you want to call it, throwing programs, back in 2014 to 2015, that right after 2014. So it's 2015 when I first started. And I have, read a lot of research. When I first saw weighted balls, my initial reaction was like, cool. Yeah, it's, with the weighted footballs, like, I don't understand why this is any different than a football. I remember asking Kyle Boddy at a conference one time, like, dude, like, why don't you just have guys throw footballs? He goes, well, they're throwing a baseball all the time, right? I go, yeah. I go, my aspect with the football thing is that, what I like the most about throwing a football is it forces guys to throw it correctly. You're throwing, if you're going to throw a wounded duck, if you're not throwing it correctly. And I love the natural pronation that it helps when you're teaching throwing a football. So to kind of break down weighted balls and what I've done, I have ran programs and camps where we haven't done any weighted ball stuff at all. And I guess I'll just get this out of the way. We have never thrown and released a weighted ball in any LT camp. Like, I've never thrown and released a weighted ball ever. And I'll kind of touch on as things have gone. But I have ran camps where we've never even done any kind of holds, because what we do utilize at Laird's training is hold. We do throwing holds. And I'll organize it with, middle schoolers aren't doing any holds. The high schoolers are doing weighted holds. And I organize it by, mechanical analysis, seeing if guys, have good arm actions. And we do a lot of knee work. We'll do a lot of extra stuff when it comes to making sure guys are throwing, correctly from, the knee to the walking windups, to throwing on flat ground pins, to full bull pins. We try to do all of those things as much as possible. But I would put it this way: every single camp that we've ever ran, we've had results in increase in velocity. Like, that's one thing I'm really proud about. My whole mindset as a strength coach, when I first started doing these programs, I go, you know what? I want guys to get bigger, stronger, faster. So what we're going to focus on is we're going to focus on getting a strong ass core. We're going to focus on getting strong legs, like getting really, really tough and strong in the bottom half. We're going to match very similar planes of movement that pitchers do. We're going to do a lot of rotational plyometrics. We're going to do a lot of lower body plyometrics. And so I've ran programs where we just focus on those things in long toss. We've made gains. I've ran programs where we did those things and through footballs. We've thrown a official size football, and we've done a junior size football. We've done both of those, got gains. We've ran the programs where we've done the weighted holds and all those things. We made gains. To me, there's a theme here, right? And to me, it's an organization, basically an organization of a program, over a long period of time, where you're constantly teaching guys you're helping increase their mobility, you're helping increase their strength, you're helping and working on their fast twitch muscles. You're teaching them to be more explosive. All of these things will increase your velocity. Weighted balls, yes, they show they increase your velocity. For me, and when I've ran these programs, my thing is like, okay, I want people to show up and I want people to make gains. I want them to come back too, obviously, right? It's a business. You want people to come back. So I'm going to keep guys healthy, and I'm going to increase these things. Because for me, I talk to college coaches all the time. I'm blessed to coach a lot of elite athletes in travel baseball and stuff. And the number one thing that coaches say to me all the time when the freshmen show up on campus and they're not ready is physically. They're physically not ready from a weight room perspective, training day in and day out and playing on the field in that same time. They're not ready. And with arm injuries in baseball, most arm injuries happen from being detrained, not they're undertrained. They're not trained enough to throw. They think that 3-4 days off from throwing off the bump is what they need that's where the injuries happen. So over the years, it's gone from, hey, I've always thought like we've got to train the deceleration muscles. That's something we've always trained. And luckily with me, with my injuries, with my labrum, my elbow injuries in the past, I used to do rice bucket all the time. We utilize that a lot. All these old school methods and new school methods that I learned from my injuries and things that I did growing up, because I was always a hard thrower growing up. I could throw in the low 90s when I was really in good shape and from the outfield before all my injuries and from across the infield in high school. I've got guys that have surpassed me by a long shot now. And I think that's awesome. And that's so cool. That's what you want as a coach. But when I initially started my program, it was, we're going to do everything that I did when I was growing up, plus the knowledge base of arm care and recovery, and the knowledge from, my degrees and all this stuff to take care of arms. Right. And then as the weighted ball studies started coming out, and I found out that, those holds up, and I'm going to start utilizing this. So we started utilizing that. I still haven't thrown and released. I want to watch more studies, because for me, 25% is an alarming rate. And I'm not that, like, I always consider myself, I'm a smart guy, but I'm nowhere near as smart as these guys that are ahead at this, research wise. I'm nowhere close to as smart as these guys. So I like reading studies and seeing things. And for me, if throwing and releasing a weighted ball and you have that 25% injury rate, that's too high for me. Like, that's way too high. So I personally, I'm not going to do anything like that until we get going, but I just did the Savage certification. So let's talk about what I've changed just a little bit recently. Florida baseball training, a lot of the research shows the 7-ounce weighted ball is less stress on your arm. And for those who are listening, all the research on the lower balls, the underload balls, there's more stress on your arm's moving faster. So the 7-ounce ball, they like using the throwing sock with the 7-ounce ball. And they went from using those holds with the PlyoCare balls to throwing with the sock because it's more natural. They noticed that it doesn't disrupt their arm action that they're trying to teach, the proper arm action mechanics that they're trying to teach. And I loved that. And I was like, oh, this is awesome. So this most recent program, we started actually essentially throwing a 7-ounce weighted ball. So we've officially gone to throwing and releasing a weighted ball, but we're technically not releasing a weighted ball because it's in a sock. And for those that don't know, basically the sock the hand is like 2 or 3 inches away from the end of the sock. You throw a ball and the ball snaps and pops in the sock, and it'll naturally help you with pronation and it'll help you strengthen the decelerators as you're going through. And it's, the theory behind it is awesome. It's teaching you not to finish with the linear deceleration and get the nice, natural, good pronation and good follow through. So technically we are throwing and releasing, but technically we're not. But I'll continue that. And as the research comes and goes, for me, I see guys whose elbows are weak. I see shoulders that are weak. I see scaps that move horribly. They're not moved efficiently. So the mobility and stability in the scaps are bad. I see weak upper backs, weak lower traps, which help elevate the scapula. I see kids that, are doing a lot of things with their fingers, whether it's video games, squeezing and gripping stuff in the weight room, not working their extensors to protect the arm. Because when you throw, like from what I've read, the UCL takes about 52% of the stress when you're throwing, that valgus stress when you're throwing in your elbow. The rest of that stress is the muscles surrounding that. So if the muscles surrounding that joint are weak, you're increasing your likelihood of getting hurt and increasing the likelihood of UCL injuries. And with all this weighted ball, to kind of, again, to play devil's advocate, and the reason why we don't throw and release, do I hate weighted balls? Absolutely not. Like for me, it's like, if people want to throw and release, I think 18 years or older is kind of where to go to. If you look at all the research and all the video is done with elite professional athletes and elite college athletes. That's, for me, is like, I think they should be doing that. And obviously there's a lot of people that do it and don't get hurt. And then the young guys, I think what we need to focus on from 18 and younger, we need to focus on the strength. We need to focus on the prehab. We need to focus on the stability, the explosives. We need to focus on maxing out all of our capabilities that we can control right now before we start going, we're going to start throwing and releasing weighted balls. That's just my stance on it. Doesn't mean that other people can't stay healthy and do it. And for a long period of time, absolutely not. Like there's a lot of people that throw weighted balls can stay healthy for a long period of time. But what I do know is the injury rate is higher. Like all the research shows that people that are involved in weighted baseball training, weighted throwing programs have a higher risk for injury. So that is a fact that's irrefutable. But like I said before, that doesn't mean that everything's healthy. Like you have a risk for injury for everything. So I see both sides. So I've learned now after all these years that to not speak in absolutes, to believe in what you believe and implement things that you believe, because there is fact, but there's more than one fact out there. There's more than one way to do things. There's more than one way to help athletes, help increase velocity. Everybody's going to have their different opinions and different ways of doing things. But for those that are listening, when it comes to weighted baseball training, you have to make sure that you are focusing on health first. You're focusing on strength and conditioning first. You're focusing on the body. You're focusing on the legs. You're focusing on the elbow, the shoulder, all these high risk injury areas. And again, like mobility is a huge, huge factor. You know, if you got somebody with a pulled hip flexor on their drive leg and they're trying to throw, do you think that's going to affect their mechanics? Hell yeah, it's going to affect your mechanics. So I've seen guys to try to throw with a pulled hamstring. I've seen guys try to throw with a pulled quad, and it has affected them and ultimately led to problems. So for those, you know, to kind of, you know, finish that answer, Adam, you know, we don't actually throw and release weighted balls. We use them for a lot of things. We do use them for arm circles and shoulder and scap stability. We do throw, we will throw them backwards. We'll do our, you know, our backward tosses, our upward tosses, reverse throws. We do throw and release those as heavy as 2 pounds. So we do throw them, but it's more backwards. So it's, to me, I think this is such a cool topic because there's so many different opinions on the fact, but this is just where LT stands and where we've gone. If I can get results for people at a very high level, help guys, like we've had guys throw as hard as 97 miles an hour at Laird's training. If I can help people develop to that and keep them healthy, that's what we're going to do.
No, and it makes total sense too. And I think if you are, say you're 18 and up and you're throwing these weighted balls, one thing that's underrated is when you're throwing these weighted balls, like you still need a target to aim at. You're not just chunking this ball as hard as you can and you're losing your mechanics of trying to be accurate with this ball too. Because yes, we want to throw hard, but to this day and age, we still have to throw strikes and we have to have a target that we're aiming at, consistently trying to hit. Same thing with you throwing the plyo balls is I'm still trying to hit, maybe mark an X with some chalk and you're throwing it into the wall just to give your brain an image of what you're trying to actually throw at instead of just chunking this ball all around, having no idea where the ball is going to go. So that's one thing that can be lost if you're throwing these weighted balls and actually releasing them. So we've done the sock holds too. That was one big thing that I enjoyed with the Florida Baseball Ranch, and we saw good results out of, and it just made too much sense not to do it. And at first it was like kind of like, how is this going to help? But then as you start to understand the study, it's like, man, I see the benefits of it, as well as you're trying to get something while you're not trying to give up something in return out of it. So the injury versus the risk and reward is kind of right there in the middle. But no, that was a great stance there, just kind of debating and how you had success doing things you've done without not even releasing a weighted ball. Another thing I'll hit on is like if you're doing a lesson or you're taking your kid in for a lesson, you're not throwing a weighted ball once a week with the lesson. Like that is going to be an absolute disaster. So make sure you are in a program that is a velocity based or a throwing based program where you're doing this 3 to 4 to 5 times a week. Because otherwise you just chunking a weighted ball once a week, like you're just asking for a disaster and you're asking for a doctor visit coming up soon because you're probably going to injure your elbow and you're probably going to injure your shoulder. And one more thing I want to hit on is like the mechanics of throwing is so important, man. And I wish I would actually got taught how to throw. I don't remember looking back now ever being specifically taught how to throw a baseball. It was kind of, hey, just grab it and throw it. And looking back of getting on the knee and working on the one knee, the two knees, throwing footballs. One of my things I think a strength that I got my arm strong was I'd warm up with a football for 5 to 10 minutes before I even touched the baseball. And you mentioned before, it makes you develop a good throwing motion. And that also strengthens it because it's 16 ounces. So you're out throwing a weighted ball. You're just throwing a football with it. That's also helping clean your arm path. And then grab the baseball, do your long toss session. And not only did it make me feel good, but I saw results from it. And I think that was a big part of it was throwing the football around. And if football was not, if it was as bad as throwing a baseball, so to speak, like you notice that football players don't go on injured reserve or the DL from throwing too much. Like you never hear about that because the throwing pattern is so clean and you have to be clean to have the spiral. Otherwise, you are going to injure yourself if you're throwing a bunch of ducks because something's not working right. And another thing too was like, I never really understand when we talk about throwing mechanics, like the pronation at the end. The only time I ever heard pronation was when guys would talk about changeups. And now when you look, you're like, oh, dang, everybody throws and it's supposed to be pronation. But
Yeah.
it was something that we were never taught. Like I think,
Yeah.
and Randy talked about it at Florida Baseball Ranches, like you're putting your sword in your pocket, basically. You're feeling that rotation over, the pronation over, where it's coming across and then it's coming to the front pocket. And just by doing that, like messing around with it myself, I was like, man, this feels so much better than kind of like cutting the ball or throwing around the ball. Because many kids, you watch and play catch with them, they're not even doing their pronation. Number one, they probably don't know, but they're getting around every ball and they're just putting stress on that arm and that elbow and the flexors and the tendons in there. And before you know it, they're going to get to high levels when they actually start to throw harder. And now you're going to really have some injuries come into it. So guys, learn the mechanics first. And if you don't know how to teach them, then go find somebody that can teach them. And don't feel, like I said, don't feel bad that you don't. I know I was never taught. I don't know about Sean, but I was never physically taught how to throw a baseball. And it's something that gets overlooked all the time, where somebody may look at you and be like, hey, that kind of looks weird. You should try this. But there's never been an actual set of, let's video you throwing and breaking down your actual throwing mechanics. Because if you want to lift 300 pounds, you're not going to walk in the weight room if you've never done it before and just expect to jump right up to 300 right off the bat. It's a process of developing to get there. So let's get the mechanics first right. And then now, hey, I think I'm ready to start adding some velocity. Okay, well, let's check you out in the weight room. Okay, your body's ready to handle it. Now let's start to implement you these weighted balls that we're going to implement, and you can start to throw and learn now that everything else is ready to go. But this is the last step, in my opinion, not the first step.
Yeah, and to kind of close out with this is for those that are listening, when you do these weighted ball programs, like an increase of 2-3 mile an hour, is awesome, right? An off season of increase in velocity, up to 5 or 6, that's awesome. A program for 2 or 3 months, 2-3 mile an hour, it's awesome. But when you see these crazy increases of velocity of like 8 to 10 mile an hour, for those to understand this, that's a neural adaptation. That's not a physiological adaptation. And so, if you want to stay healthy for a long period of time, in a perfect world, you increase velocity slow and steady over a long period of time, because it gives your body time, your physical part of your body, your physiological response time to get acclimated with that, to protect its arm and increase that velocity. When you get these high jumps in velocity, these neural adaptations that are high, those are the people that have the highest risks for injury. And I always tell people, like in our programs, when they have big jumps, like, hey, that's awesome, but that just happened in a very short amount of time. If you're not doing, I call prehab work or taking care of your arm like recovery work. That's just what I call it. A lot of people call it like that because you want to recover and get your arm bigger, faster, stronger. My mindset is like, let's get you. And when I say bigger, faster, and stronger, strength for me is getting bigger, faster, stronger. So for those that are listening, like, don't look for a quick fix. If you get a high increase in velocity really quickly, you're a higher risk for injury. If you're steady increasing over a long period of time, you're the guy that's really doing things the right way. And for me, it's like before, like, again, don't take my beliefs, don't take Adam's beliefs. Let's follow some actual factual science. Like, let's make sure that you're in a long toss program. Let's make sure you're in a strength and conditioning program. Let's make sure you're fixing problems, movement problems, mobility problems. Let's make sure your mechanics are cleaned up, like Adam was just really stressing about, because it's so important before actually. Let's make sure we're covering all these bases first before we even think about weighted balls. Like, we don't go to the advanced type of training in the weight room with new guys or young guys because they're not ready for it yet. You've got to build up into that, and you've got to understand that, like, I don't care, if daddy wants, Johnny to be better than everybody else who's going to get a weighted ball program, and to skip all the other steps. Like, you've got to understand that you are willing to sacrifice your health if you're going to skip all these other steps in the process. But that's kind of wanted to end it with. Adam, is there anything else you want to add on there toward the end?
No, man, it's all good. I was excited about this one. I'm going to be excited about the kind of get Ryan and Keegan's point of view on the next one.
Yeah, guys, if you guys enjoyed this episode, please leave that 5-star review. We really like this. If you guys want us to touch on more detail on this in the future, we definitely will. We're actually getting ready to record episode 2, so we're really excited for this coming up next with professional ball players Ryan Garton and Keegan Curtis. So until next time, guys, we'll see you later.